Why was my 15-year-old son suddenly obsessed with learning Spanish? My son Derek had always been the kid who did exactly the bare minimum in school, not because he wasn't smart, but because he'd decided early on that academic achievement was somehow uncool and beneath his carefully cultivated image of indifference. He'd scrape by with C's and D's, occasionally pulling off a B when a teacher threatened to fail him, but never showing genuine interest in any subject. Languages especially seemed to bore him to tears, and he'd complained loudly throughout 8th grade that learning French was a complete waste of his time. So when I walked past his bedroom door on a Wednesday evening in October and heard him muttering Spanish words to himself, I actually stopped and backtracked to make sure I'd heard correctly. He was sitting at his desk with his laptop open, repeating phrases under his breath with intense concentration that I'd never seen him apply to homework before. The Spanish pronunciation sounded awkward and forced, like someone reading phonetically from a textbook without understanding the words. I knocked on his doorframe and he jumped like I'd caught him doing something illegal, quickly minimizing whatever was on his screen. The guilty expression on his face made me immediately suspicious, but I tried to play it casual. "Since when are you interested in Spanish?" I asked, leaning against the doorway with my arms crossed. He shrugged and said his guidance counselor mentioned that colleges really liked seeing students take initiative with foreign languages, especially ones that weren't offered at his school. Our high school only taught French and German, so teaching himself Spanish would supposedly look impressive on applications. The explanation made sense on the surface, but Derek was 15 and had never mentioned college once in his entire life. He was the kid who insisted he'd become a professional gamer or YouTube star and didn't need traditional education. Now suddenly he cared about impressing college admissions officers? Something didn't add up, but I didn't want to discourage what seemed like positive academic initiative. I told him I was proud of him for taking his future seriously, and left him to his studying. Over the next week, Derek's sudden Spanish obsession intensified to a level that seemed almost manic. He was staying up past midnight with his door closed, and I could hear him having what sounded like conversations in Spanish through the wall. When I asked who he was talking to, he said he'd found language exchange partners online who helped him practice pronunciation. That made sense, and there were definitely legitimate websites for that kind of thing. But something about his tone when he explained it felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared the answer in advance. I started paying more attention to his behavior, noticing small inconsistencies that individually seemed meaningless, but together formed a concerning pattern. He'd installed a second lock on his bedroom door, claiming he needed privacy for his video calls with language partners. His phone was suddenly password protected when it had never been before, and he'd angle the screen away from me whenever I walked past. Most tellingly, his grades hadn't improved at all despite this supposed newfound dedication to academic achievement. Thursday morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard Derek's voice coming from his bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him speaking rapid Spanish to someone on what sounded like a video call. But this wasn't the halting beginner Spanish I'd heard him practicing earlier in the week. This was fluent, confident Spanish with proper grammar and natural rhythm, the kind of fluency that takes years to develop. He was laughing at something the other person said, using colloquial expressions and slang that definitely weren't in any textbook. My Spanish was rusty, but good enough from 4 years of high school classes to recognize that my son was having a completely natural conversation in a language he'd supposedly just started learning. When I pushed the bathroom door open, Derek practically dropped his phone into the sink. He fumbled to end the call while his face turned bright red, stammering something about his language partner being really good at teaching conversational phrases. I asked point blank how long he'd actually been learning Spanish, and he insisted it had only been 2 weeks. But he was a really fast learner and had been practicing constantly. The lie was so obvious that I didn't even bother arguing. Instead, I told him we'd talk about it later when I got home from work and left the house before I said something I'd regret. All day at the office, I couldn't focus on anything except trying to figure out what was happening with my son. The most logical explanation was that he'd been learning Spanish for much longer than he claimed, but why would he hide that? And if he'd been studying secretly for months or years, what had motivated him to suddenly pretend he was just starting now? I ran through various scenarios, each one more concerning than the last. Maybe he was involved with something illegal and needed Spanish to communicate with dealers or gang members. Maybe he'd met someone online who was grooming him and had convinced him to learn their language. Maybe he was planning to run away to Mexico or South America. By the time I left work, I'd worked myself into a state of near panic over my son's secret Spanish fluency. I stopped at the store on the way home and bought a notebook, deciding I needed to start documenting everything suspicious about Derek's behavior. That evening, I made his favorite dinner and tried to have a casual conversation about school and friends, hoping he'd reveal something useful. He was guarded and monosyllabic, giving one-word answers while checking his phone constantly under the table. When I asked directly if there was anything going on in his life that he wanted to talk about, he looked at me with such genuine fear that my heart clenched. But then he just shook his head and said everything was fine. He was just stressed about school. After dinner, he disappeared into his room again, and I heard the distinctive sound of a video call connecting. I crept down the hallway and pressed my ear against his door, feeling guilty for eavesdropping but too worried to care about privacy. Derek was speaking Spanish again, his voice soft and intimate in a way that made it clear this wasn't a language exchange partner or study buddy. The conversation was mostly too muffled to make out specific words, but I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. He said something about his dad getting suspicious and needing to be more careful. The other person responded with concern, their voice higher-pitched and younger-sounding than I'd expected. Derek reassured them that everything would be okay, that he just needed more time before he could tell me the truth. Then he said something in Spanish that I understood perfectly, because it was one of the first phrases anyone learns in any language. Te amo. I love you. My 15-year-old son was in love with someone who spoke Spanish, someone he'd apparently been hiding from me for long enough to become fluent in their language, someone who made him sound happier than I'd heard him in years. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the wall to steady myself. Who was this person? How had they met? How long had this been going on? And most terrifyingly, how old were they? I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide what to do. Confronting Derek directly would probably just make him defensive and cause him to hide things better. Going through his room felt like a massive violation of trust. But wasn't he the one who'd violated my trust by lying about this secret relationship? I thought about all the true crime documentaries I'd watched about teenagers being lured by predators online, groomed into relationships through manipulation and false promises. What if Derek thought he was in love, but was actually being exploited by someone much older who'd spent months or years earning his trust? The thought made me physically ill, and by morning I'd decided I needed more information before taking action. I called in sick to work and waited for Derek to leave for school, then immediately went into his room to search for evidence. His laptop was password protected, but I knew he kept a notebook in his desk drawer where he wrote down all his passwords because he could never remember them. Finding the notebook felt like a small victory, though using it to invade his privacy made me feel like the worst parent in the world. I logged into his laptop and started going through his browser history, expecting to find dating sites or chat rooms or something obviously concerning. Instead, there was almost nothing. He'd clearly been deleting his history regularly, which was suspicious in itself, but didn't give me any concrete information. His email was similarly sanitized, with only school-related messages and spam. I was about to give up when I noticed a folder buried in his documents labeled Spanish Homework, with a creation date from 3 years ago. 3 years. My son had been learning Spanish in secret since he was 12 years old. The folder contained hundreds of documents, vocabulary lists, grammar exercises, journal entries written entirely in Spanish that detailed his daily life and thoughts. I opened the most recent journal entry and started reading. My Spanish rusty enough that I had to use Google Translate for some words, but good enough to get the general meaning. Derek had written about feeling trapped and scared, about being in love with someone his family would never approve of, about learning an entire language just to be able to communicate with this person properly. He wrote about the terror of his dad finding out and the certainty that I would forbid them from seeing each other. The entry was dated 3 days ago, right after our conversation about his sudden interest in Spanish. He'd been pretending to just start learning because he'd gotten sloppy, and I'd almost caught him speaking fluently. The fake beginner routine was meant to throw me off the trail while he figured out how to better hide his relationship. I kept reading through the journal entries, going backwards in time to try to understand the full story. 6 months ago, Derek wrote about celebrating an anniversary with someone named Isabella, describing their first meeting and how nervous he'd been. A year ago, he wrote about the frustration of only being able to communicate through translation apps and his determination to learn proper Spanish. 18 months ago, the entries were full of excitement about a new girl who'd just moved to town from Colombia and how beautiful she was despite not speaking any English. 2 years ago, he wrote about a new student in his 8th grade class who sat alone at lunch because she couldn't talk to anyone. That was where the story started. My son had befriended a girl who spoke no English, taught himself Spanish to communicate with her, and had been in a relationship with her for over a year while hiding it from everyone in his life. The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. This wasn't a predator or an online grooming situation. This was a teenage romance with a girl his own age, a girl who apparently lived in our town and went to his school. But the relief was quickly followed by confusion and hurt. Why would Derek feel the need to hide a girlfriend from me? I'd always told him he could talk to me about anything, that I wanted to be involved in his life. Had I done something to make him think I wouldn't approve of her? Was it because she was from Colombia? I'd never given him any reason to think I was prejudiced or close-minded about different cultures. I sat there in his room, surrounded by years of secret Spanish study and hidden journal entries, trying to understand why my son thought he needed to learn an entire language in secret rather than just introduce me to his girlfriend like a normal teenager. I spent the rest of the day reading through Derek's journals, piecing together the timeline of his relationship with Isabella. They'd met in 8th grade when she'd just moved to the United States with her mother, who'd gotten a nursing job at our local hospital. Isabella spoke zero English and was completely isolated at school, eating lunch alone and struggling in all her classes because she couldn't understand the teachers. Derek had noticed her sitting by herself and decided to try to be friendly, using Google Translate on his phone to have basic conversations. She'd been grateful for the companionship, and they'd started spending lunch periods together, slowly learning to communicate through a combination of translation apps, gestures, and patience. That summer, Derek had started teaching himself Spanish using free online resources and YouTube videos, determined to actually be able to talk to Isabella without the barrier of technology between them. By the time freshman year started, Derek could hold simple conversations in Spanish, and his friendship with Isabella had deepened into something more. He wrote about their first kiss behind the gym, about holding hands in the hallway between classes, about the thrill and terror of being in a secret relationship. But why was it secret? That question nagged at me as I kept reading. Finally, I found an entry from about a year ago that explained everything. Derek had invited Isabella to our house for dinner, planning to introduce her to me as his girlfriend. But the day before, I'd apparently made some comment about our neighbor's daughter dating someone from a completely different background, and how those relationships rarely worked out because of cultural differences. I had absolutely no memory of saying this, but Derek had interpreted it as a sign that I would disapprove of Isabella. He'd canceled the dinner and decided to keep their relationship hidden until he was old enough that my opinion wouldn't matter. The entry made me feel sick with guilt. I'd apparently made some thoughtless comment about other people's relationships, probably not even meaning anything by it, and my son had internalized it as a judgment about his own choices. He'd spent over a year hiding someone he loved, learning an entire language in secret, living in constant fear of being discovered, all because of something careless I'd said without thinking. I sat there in his room holding the journal and started crying, overwhelmed by the realization that I'd failed my son in a fundamental way. He hadn't felt safe coming to me with something important, hadn't trusted that I would support him, had literally learned Spanish in secret rather than risk my disapproval. What kind of parent creates that kind of fear in their child? When Derek came home from school that afternoon, he found me sitting in the living room with his journal on the coffee table. His face went white and then red, cycling through shock and anger and fear in rapid succession. He started to say something, but I held up my hand and asked him to just listen. I told him I'd read his journals and knew about Isabella, knew he'd been learning Spanish for 3 years to be able to talk to her, knew he'd been hiding their relationship because he thought I wouldn't approve. I apologized for whatever comment I'd made that had scared him into secrecy, told him I didn't even remember saying it, but that I was sorry for creating an environment where he felt he couldn't be honest with me. I said I wanted to meet Isabella, that I wanted to be part of his life instead of someone he had to hide things from. Derek stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears, and then asked if I was serious or if this was some kind of trap. The fact that my son thought I might be setting a trap for him broke my heart all over again. I promised him I was completely serious, that I just wanted him to be happy and safe, that hiding a relationship wasn't healthy for anyone involved. He asked what would happen if I met Isabella and didn't like her. I told him honestly that my opinion shouldn't determine who he dated, that he was old enough to make his own choices about relationships as long as they were safe and healthy. But I also said that keeping secrets had clearly been stressing him out, and that bringing things into the open would be better for everyone. Derek was quiet for a long time, and I could practically see him trying to decide whether to trust me. Finally, he pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking rapid Spanish to whoever answered. He had a brief conversation, then hung up and told me Isabella would be coming over in an hour. She wanted to meet me too, had actually been asking Derek for months why she couldn't meet his family. I spent that hour in a state of nervous anticipation, tidying the living room and trying to figure out what to say to this girl who my son had learned an entire language for. When the doorbell rang, Derek practically ran to answer it, and I heard 2 voices speaking Spanish in the entryway. Then he led Isabella into the living room, holding her hand tightly like he was afraid she might run away. She was small and pretty with long dark hair and nervous brown eyes, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked slightly too big on her thin frame. Derek introduced her in English, and she gave me a shy smile and said in heavily accented English that she was very happy to finally meet me. I told her in my rusty Spanish that I was happy to meet her too, and her whole face lit up with surprise and relief. We sat down in the living room, and I asked her to tell me about herself, about her life in Colombia, and why she'd moved here, and what it had been like adjusting to a new country. Isabella opened up gradually, her English improving as she got more comfortable. She explained that her mother had been a nurse in Bogota, but couldn't find work after Isabella's father died, so she'd taken a job in the United States to give her daughter better opportunities. Moving here had been terrifying for Isabella, who'd gone from being a popular student in Colombia to being completely isolated because of the language barrier. Derek had been the first person to show her kindness, the first friend she'd made, and she'd fallen in love with him slowly over months of patient communication and genuine care. She talked about how hard he'd worked to learn Spanish, how he'd practiced for hours every day because he wanted to understand her properly instead of relying on translation apps. The pride and affection in her voice when she talked about Derek was obvious, and I could see why my son had learned an entire language for this girl. She was sweet and genuine and clearly cared about him deeply. We talked for over 2 hours, switching between English and Spanish as Isabella's comfort level fluctuated. She told me about her dreams of becoming a doctor like her father had been, about missing Colombia, but appreciating the opportunities in America, about her mother working long shifts at the hospital and how lonely their apartment felt sometimes. Derek sat next to her the whole time, holding her hand and occasionally translating when her English failed her. I watched them together and realized they had something real and substantial, not just a teenage crush, but genuine partnership built on over 2 years of getting to know each other, despite significant obstacles. When Isabella finally said she needed to go home for dinner, I walked her to the door and told her in Spanish that she was welcome in our house anytime, that I hoped she'd come back soon. She hugged me impulsively, thanking me for understanding and for not being angry about the secret, and I hugged her back while trying not to cry again. After she left, Derek and I had another long conversation about trust and honesty, and why secrets are almost always more harmful than the truth. I apologized again for creating an environment where he felt he needed to hide things from me, and he apologized for lying and sneaking around instead of giving me a chance to surprise him with acceptance. We agreed that going forward, we'd both try harder to communicate openly, even when it was uncomfortable or scary. I asked if there was anything else he'd been hiding, and after a long pause, he admitted that he'd been planning to apply to colleges with strong Spanish programs because he was thinking about becoming a translator or working in international business. The academic initiative I'd been so confused about suddenly made complete sense. He wasn't trying to impress admissions officers with random Spanish knowledge. He'd found something he was genuinely passionate about through his relationship with Isabella and wanted to build a future around it. Over the next few weeks, Isabella became a regular presence in our house. She'd come over for dinner several times a week, helping me cook Colombian dishes and teaching me Spanish phrases while Derek did his homework. I got to know her mother, a tired but kind woman who worked 60-hour weeks, and was grateful her daughter had found good friends in this new country. Isabella's English improved rapidly with more practice, and I watched her transform from a shy, isolated teenager into a confident young woman who participated actively in school and made other friends beyond Derek. Their relationship continued to grow stronger, built on the solid foundation of all those months of patient communication and genuine effort to understand each other. Derek's grades improved dramatically as he applied his newfound academic motivation to all his subjects, not just Spanish. He joined the debate team and started talking about going to college, about futures and plans and possibilities I'd never heard him express interest in before. 6 months after I discovered the truth, Derek brought home his report card with straight A's for the first time in his academic career. His Spanish teacher had written a note saying he was the most dedicated student she'd ever taught and was recommending him for advanced placement. His other teachers commented on his improved focus and participation, his willingness to ask questions and seek help when he needed it. I posted the report card on the refrigerator with pride, thinking about how close I'd come to missing all of this because of one thoughtless comment I didn't even remember making. That evening, Isabella came over for dinner, and the 3 of us sat around the table talking about college options, about programs that would let them study together, about the possibility of spending a semester abroad in Colombia. Derek translated smoothly between English and Spanish as the conversation flowed, his fluency now obvious and unremarkable after months of using it openly. Looking back, I'm grateful for that Wednesday evening when I heard Derek muttering Spanish words in his bedroom. That moment of suspicion and concern set off a chain of events that ultimately brought us closer together and helped me become a better parent. I learned that teenagers will go to extraordinary lengths to protect things they care about when they don't feel safe being honest, that casual comments can have lasting impacts we never intend, and that love is powerful enough to motivate a 15-year-old boy to teach himself an entire language in secret. Derek learned that honesty is almost always better than secrecy, that parents can surprise you with understanding when given the chance, and that real relationships flourish when brought into the light instead of hidden in darkness. And Isabella learned that she had a second family in America who cared about her well-being and wanted to see her succeed. A year later, Derek and Isabella are still together, now planning which colleges to apply to together. His Spanish is completely fluent, good enough that Isabella's mother often forgets he's not a native speaker. He started tutoring other students in Spanish, using his own experience of learning through necessity to help them connect with the language. I sometimes think about that alternate timeline where I never discovered the secret, where Derek continued hiding his relationship until he left for college, where years of mistrust and distance grew between us because I'd thoughtlessly created an environment of fear. That timeline doesn't exist because I paid attention to inconsistencies, because I pushed past my discomfort to invade his privacy when I thought he might be in danger, because I was willing to admit my mistakes and change my behavior when confronted with the consequences. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.